We are living in an age of curated distractions, where the headlines we scroll past in our most fleeting moments of boredom rarely offer even a glimpse into the reality of what is actually unfolding. They give us the flash, the noise, and the sizzle of a political confrontation, but they almost always miss the quiet, grinding mechanisms working beneath the surface, the deep structural changes that will continue to shape our civic existence long after the temporary excitement of today's news cycle has turned to ash. This story regarding Microsoft's latest investment is the perfect example of that phenomenon. On the surface, it is a straightforward announcement. One of the most influential and powerful technology corporations in human history is choosing Canada over the United States for a massive, generational expansion of its operations. At first glance, it looks like a simple business transaction, a matter of spreadsheets and boardrooms. But if you pull back the curtain, you begin to see that this is precisely the kind of event that only appears simple until you look at the stakes. Because what looks like a tale of corporate investment is, in truth, a story about how modern nations compete for their own sovereignty, their stability, and their very identity in the dawning age of artificial intelligence. You likely saw the headline and dismissed it as just another business decision, a corporate giant moving pieces on a global chessboard. But what you missed, what most people missed, is that this is a deeply political act. It is a constitutional moment, a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of North America, dressed in the polite and professional clothing of economic development. So, let me walk you through what is actually happening beneath the noise. Microsoft has designated Canada as the primary site for a sweeping multi-billion-dollar expansion of its artificial intelligence infrastructure. We aren't talking about a symbolic office in a trendy neighborhood or a modest outpost meant to appease local regulators. This is one of the largest digital infrastructure investments this country has ever hosted in its entire history. That alone is enough to make it noteworthy. But the deeper, more tectonic significance lies in the fact that this decision came at the direct expense of the United States. For generations, the United States was the default, unquestioned destination for this kind of technology-heavy build-out. For decades, the sheer gravitational pull of the American market, its massive pool of capital, its overwhelming political clout, and its unparalleled technological ecosystem meant that companies rarely even looked north across the border unless they were searching for specific talent or a few tax credits to balance the books. Yet today, Microsoft sat down, ran the numbers, looked at the horizon of the next 30 years, and made a radically different calculation. The question you should be asking yourself is, why? To truly understand that choice, you have to look at the emerging concept that is currently reshaping modern geopolitics, something known as digital sovereignty. This is the radical but necessary notion that a nation's data, the invisible, pulsing lifeblood of its citizens, its economy, and its democratic institutions, ought to reside within its own physical borders and under the protection of its own laws. In a world where almost every facet of your life, your banking, your private health records, your daily communications, and even your most subtle political habits passes through cloud servers, the question of jurisdiction becomes simple but incredibly profound. Whose laws govern your information? When you click a button or send a message, whose judges and whose politicians have the ultimate authority over that data? For years, the answer to that question, almost by default, was the United States. American companies built the vast majority of the world's digital backbone. As a direct consequence, much of the entire world's data flowed into American data centers, often without the users or even the governments of other nations giving a single thought to what that implied for their own autonomy. But the last few years have completely rewired the global political imagination. Nations have begun to understand, often the hard way, that the physical location of data is about much more than technical convenience or latency. It is about control. It is about law. It is about national autonomy in a digital era. Canada, under the leadership of a prime minister who views institutional stability as a primary competitive advantage in a chaotic world, recognized this shift earlier than most. You might not follow the deep political currents that run beneath these corporate choices every day, but this matters to you personally because the institutions you rely on to live your life, from the hospitals that treat your family to the schools that educate your children and the local governments that manage your streets, are increasingly built on top of a digital scaffolding. Where that scaffolding sits, where the physical servers are bolted into the floor, determines who holds the power to access it, who can regulate it, or who can compel it to act. This is why Microsoft's decision is not simply a matter of corporate preference or a better real estate deal. It is the culmination of a deliberate, long-term national strategy to present Canada as a stable, reliable alternative to a United States that is increasingly caught in unpredictable political cycles and jurisdictional turbulence. Companies that once viewed America as the safest, most predictable regulatory harbor in the world are now beginning to hedge their bets. They are looking for a sanctuary of predictability, and Canada has carefully positioned itself to be that sanctuary. You might be tempted to dismiss that as nothing more than clever political branding, but you have to understand something about the way these giants operate. Companies with massive shareholder obligations and multi-billion-dollar long-term infrastructure plans do not make decisions based on slogans or fancy marketing. They make them based on a cold, hard assessment of risk. And to those companies, Canada is beginning to look significantly less risky than the alternatives. Of course, none of this would carry any weight if the physical infrastructure behind artificial intelligence did not demand such an extraordinary amount of resources. We often talk about the cloud as if it is something ethereal and weightless, but the reality is much more industrial. Artificial intelligence devours energy. It devours water for cooling. It devours vast tracts of land and a constant stream of high-level talent. It does not hum quietly in the background of our lives. It roars. Every single question you ask an AI system forces a massive server somewhere to perform trillions of computations that consume electricity, generate immense heat, and require millions of gallons of water to keep the hardware from melting. So, when Microsoft looked around the world to decide where to build, it was assessing something very old and something very new. It was looking at the land, the air, the climate, and the people, the fundamental physical realities of a nation. But it was also looking at the long-term digital sovereignty of nations. Canada offered a rare, almost unique combination of a climate perfectly suited for natural cooling, an energy capacity that is ready for massive expansion, and a talent pipeline that has been cultivated over decades of quiet public investment in education and research. And that is where this story truly begins to reveal itself. When you trace the long path that brought us to this moment, you begin to see how the groundwork has been laid, often quietly, often without the fanfare or the screaming headlines that accompany more theatrical political gestures. Canada spent years, perhaps decades, cultivating a global reputation for institutional steadiness. This is the kind of reputation that doesn't dominate a 24-hour news cycle, but it becomes invaluable when a corporation is making a decision measured not in fiscal quarters, but in decades. You may not think of yourself as part of that complex calculus, but the truth is that you are. Your tax dollars support the universities that produce the engineers and the researchers who make this country an attractive technological hub. Your civic culture contributes to a political landscape that, whatever its internal tensions and its many imperfections, still appears predictable and calm in ways that other nations increasingly are not. Your expectation of stability from your institutions, an expectation you might take for granted every morning, is precisely the kind of environment that draws global investment into long-term infrastructure. As Canada pursued this strategic path, it also had to confront a hard truth that many countries eventually face. Most of the companies capable of building digital infrastructure on this massive scale do not originate within our borders. If a nation wants to host the next generation of industrial capability, whether that is in steel, manufacturing, or cloud computing, it often must partner with firms that were born elsewhere. That is not an indictment of our national ambition or a sign of weakness. It is a mature recognition of the global economic reality. Canada did not create Microsoft, But Canada has proven that it can shape the conditions under which Microsoft views this country as absolutely indispensable. And that is exactly what has happened. By emphasizing regulatory clarity, high environmental standards, and long-term infrastructure planning, the government signaled to the tech world that it was not merely seeking a series of economic transactions. It was offering a strategic long-term partnership. If you step back and consider how AI infrastructure actually functions, you can start to appreciate why these decisions carry such immense gravity. Artificial intelligence is not an abstraction floating in some digital ether. It is a massive engine built upon physical servers the size of industrial buildings, powered by electricity grids that must be strengthened and expanded, and cooled by water systems that must be managed with extreme sustainability. When a nation hosts these systems, it is not just providing a piece of land. It is committing itself to supporting an entire ecosystem of growth, responsibility, and oversight. For you as a citizen, this means that your community's water use, your energy supply, and your environmental standards are now permanently entangled with the front lines of global technological development. That entanglement brings with it immense opportunities for wealth and growth, but it also brings heavy obligations. This is where the vital concerns about sustainability enter the conversation. You may have heard reports or seen news clips suggesting that large data centers can strain local water tables or generate waste heat that alters local ecosystems. Those concerns are very real, not in a sensationalist or panicked sense, but in a deep civic sense. They remind us that every new technology, no matter how revolutionary it feels, still depends on the physical resources of the Earth. If a country invites global firms to build massive data campuses within its borders, it has a moral and political duty to guarantee that the environmental costs do not fall unfairly on the communities that host them. This is why Canada has been working to develop frameworks that require stringent environmental protections before a single shovel ever hits the ground. A nation cannot honestly preach sovereignty over its digital future while neglecting the stewardship of its natural one. Yet what sets this specific moment apart from any other in our history is not merely the balance between innovation and responsibility. It is the context in which Microsoft made this choice. Around the entire world, major companies are watching political instability, sudden regulatory swings, and jurisdictional uncertainties with growing concern, especially when they look at the United States. For decades, the global business community trusted that American institutions would provide a level of continuity that insulated them from unwelcome political shocks. Today, that trust is no longer as absolute as it once was. And when companies like Microsoft begin looking for geopolitical stability, they are doing more than just comparing tax rates or the cost of electricity. They are comparing systems of governance. They are comparing national commitments to the rule of law. They are weighing the reliability of democratic norms. This brings us to a deeper question, one I suspect you have already begun to ask yourself as you watch the world change. What does it mean for Canada to become a strategic choice rather than just a convenient alternative? That kind of shift does not happen because a single leader makes a persuasive speech or because a company sees a quick opportunity to expand its customer base. It happens when a country demonstrates, through its actions, that it is prepared to shoulder the heavy responsibilities of technological power. Microsoft did not bring this investment here as an act of charity or out of the goodness of their corporate heart. They brought it because Canada presented itself as a nation capable of anchoring the future of digital infrastructure, and that future, whether you welcome it with open arms or worry about its implications, will influence nearly every single aspect of your civic life. We are still only at the beginning of understanding what this truly means for our national sovereignty, for our economic independence, and for the political identity of a country that has long lived in the massive shadow of a global superpower. But the decision has been made, the trajectory has begun, and the consequences will continue to unfold for years and decades to come. What fascinates me most about this entire story is not simply the staggering scale of the investment, but the quiet mechanics behind how we actually arrived at this point. You and I live in a world where decisions often appear to be instantaneous. You see an announcement flash across your phone screen and it feels as though the world shifted in a single sudden gesture. But institutional decisions of this magnitude rarely happen suddenly. They are the result of months, even years, of cold calculations, intense negotiations, and exhaustive risk assessments. Microsoft did not simply wake up one morning and decide that Canada would become a central pillar of its global AI operations. They weighed the terrifying complexity of energy requirements. They looked at the availability of highly trained talent and the presence of world-class research institutions. They looked at the political climate on both sides of the border. And when they ran the numbers against the deep uncertainties that now shape American politics, Canada emerged as the safer, more logical long-term investment. That calculation tells us something incredibly important about how modern power actually works. Nations used to compete primarily over territory and physical resources like gold or oil. Today, they compete over data, over computing capacity, and over the stability of their regulatory environments. You might think those are abstract or academic concepts until you realize that they are what shape the tools you rely on every single day. Your banking app, your email, your medical records, your child's school databases, all of these depend entirely on cloud infrastructure, and that infrastructure depends on where companies choose to build. So a decision by Microsoft to expand into Canada is not merely a corporate expansion. It is a massive recalibration of where digital life will be stored, how it will be processed, and who will govern it. Consider how unusual this is from a historical perspective. For decades, American companies built their most advanced and sensitive infrastructure at home because home offered unmatched advantages and total safety. But today, even those American companies see that the global environment has changed. Political polarization, inconsistent regulatory signals, and the constant threat of jurisdictional conflict have made the United States a much more unpredictable environment for long-term planning. Corporations do not necessarily need perfection. What they need, above all else, is predictability. And it is precisely that predictability, something that is sometimes mocked as being dull or overly cautious, that Canada has successfully transformed into a primary competitive asset. You may not feel that stability in your daily routines, but multinational firms certainly do. They prize calm. They prize continuity. They prize the confidence that the rules of the game will not swing wildly with each election cycle. This is why leadership and vision matter. When a government makes the case that sovereignty must include digital independence, it signals to the world that the nation is thinking not in electoral cycles, but in decades. A stable digital ecosystem cannot be built on borrowed infrastructure that is ultimately governed by foreign jurisdictions. If Canadian data routinely migrates into American servers, then Canadian laws govern that data only partially and conditionally. If foreign political decisions can determine the fate of our domestic information, then sovereignty becomes a hollow slogan rather than a physical reality. The choice to court major cloud investments is a choice to close that gap, to align a nation's institutional values with the technological forces that are shaping the future of humanity. But as with all great institutional transformations, the mechanics are not purely intellectual or legal. They are physical and logistical. Data centers must be placed near energy grids that are capable of scaling up dramatically and reliably. They must sit near communities that can supply not only the engineers who design the software, but also the construction workers, the maintenance crews, and the environmental experts who keep the physical plant running. They must comply with frameworks that ensure their presence does not degrade the local quality of life, and that means that governments must have the foresight to build the rules before the companies build the campuses. When I talk about institutional scaffolding, this is exactly what I mean. The invisible rules and standards that make visible physical growth possible. Yet no institutional design is ever truly complete without examining the responsibilities of everyone involved. Companies like Microsoft, with their vast global influence and wealth, have obligations that go far beyond their profit margins, especially when their infrastructure reshapes the civic environment of the nations that host them. At the same time, the political leaders who encourage and facilitate such investment must balance their enthusiasm with a healthy dose of caution. Growth for its own sake can easily distort a nation's priorities. A country must always be brave enough to ask whether these benefits align with its long-term values. Are our communities being protected? Are our ecosystems being safeguarded? Are our citizens gaining not just jobs, but genuine sovereignty over their digital lives? These are questions that you should ask, not out of a sense of cynicism, but out of a sense of civic responsibility. Still, we should not lose sight of the broader global implications of this moment. When Microsoft chooses Canada over the United States, it signals much more than a corporate preference. It signals a shift in the global hierarchy of technological trust. Companies are placing massive bets right now on which nations will navigate the turbulence of the coming decades with steadiness rather than with spectacle. And when a country earns that trust, it gains a level of leverage that cannot be bought. It gains power not by shouting on the world stage, but by demonstrating quiet competence and strategic foresight. This moment, then, is not just a chapter in the unfolding story of artificial intelligence. It is a chapter in the story of how nations define themselves through the institutions they build and the responsibilities they are willing to shoulder. As we reach the heart of this story, I want to linger for a moment on a quieter truth that sits beneath all the noise of investment figures, political positioning, and technological ambition. What happened here is not simply that a company chose one country over another on a map. It is that a nation chose to clarify its own identity in a world where the lines between sovereignty and dependence have grown dangerously faint. Canada has long lived comfortably beside a superpower, benefiting from our proximity while maintaining an independent posture that never fully required a difficult test of autonomy in the digital era. But digital sovereignty demands more than just aspiration or polite speeches. It demands physical infrastructure, it demands stewardship, and it demands the willingness to say that a country's future cannot be outsourced for the sake of convenience. When Microsoft placed its bet on Canada, it was responding to that emerging clarity of purpose. You might be wondering what all of this actually means for you beyond these abstract terms of sovereignty or global strategy. The answer is deceptively simple, but it touches everything. Your daily life will increasingly run on systems whose reliability depends entirely on where your data is stored, how those servers are maintained, and which legal frameworks govern the information you generate without even thinking about it. Every single time you log in, every time you scroll, search, or transact, you are relying on institutions that you cannot see. We have reached a point in human history where those invisible institutions are just as important to your civic existence as the schools you attended or the roads you drive on each morning. When a nation decides that those systems should reside within its borders, under its own laws, and in total alignment with its own civic values, it is asserting something fundamental about the nature of the future, that citizenship extends into the digital realm, and that the protection of your data is not a matter of corporate convenience, but a matter of national responsibility. This is why the political stability of a country matters more today than at any other point in the last generation. Companies can build servers almost anywhere on Earth. What they cannot build so easily are predictable, reliable political environments. They cannot manufacture trust in democratic norms. And they cannot simulate the confidence that institutions will behave tomorrow with the same integrity they showed yesterday. When nations lose that stability, even marginally, companies begin to hedge their bets. And hedging, in geopolitical terms, means redirecting resources and future plans to places where the rules endure beyond the passions and the headlines of the current moment. Canada, at least for now, offers that endurance. It projects a steadiness that appeals not just to the boardrooms of corporations, but to the citizens who want their institutions to outlast the sensational headlines that often threaten to overshadow them. Yet we cannot afford to ignore the heavy responsibilities that accompany such recognition. A nation that becomes a global hub for AI infrastructure is not simply hosting a collection of machines. It is hosting an entire era of human development. These data centers will shape our energy demands, our environmental policies, our educational priorities, and our community planning for decades to come. They will influence what kinds of jobs flourish in our cities, what specific skills our children are encouraged to develop in school, and how our entire regions adapt to the footprint of a massive digital industry. As with any era of rapid and profound change, there will be tensions. Communities will rightly worry about water consumption, about ecological impacts, and about the sheer pace of development. Governments will constantly wrestle with how to regulate this explosive growth while preserving the integrity of the environments where people actually live. These concerns should not be viewed as obstacles to progress. They are the necessary guardrails of a healthy society. They ensure that our national ambition does not trample our duty of stewardship. Still, when we zoom out and look at the big picture, we see that what has unfolded here is much larger than any single province, any one company, or any individual government. It belongs to a pivotal moment in world history when nations are renegotiating their place in a new digital order. Some nations will cling to their past advantages and discover, perhaps too late, that the geopolitical gravity has shifted beneath their feet. Others will seize the opportunity to define themselves through competence and reliability rather than through spectacle and noise. Canada, through a combination of deliberate policy, institutional stability, and strategic foresight, has placed itself firmly in the latter category. It is said, perhaps more confidently than ever before, that it is prepared to anchor the pieces of the technological world that once seemed destined to reside elsewhere. And so, the Microsoft decision becomes both a powerful symbol and a difficult test. It symbolizes the growing global recognition that Canada is not merely a geography adjacent to a superpower, but a nation that is fully capable of shaping its own technological fate. And it tests whether Canada's institutions, its political culture, and its environmental obligations can truly sustain the weight of this massive new role. These are not small questions. They should not be treated as victories that have already been achieved, but as heavy responsibilities that have been accepted. As we close this conversation, I want you to reflect on the fact that sovereignty, in any era, is less about grand declarations than it is about the quiet choices we make. A country demonstrates its sovereignty through the institutions it chooses to build, the partnerships it decides to welcome, and the standards it refuses to compromise for a quick win. Microsoft did not create Canada's identity, but its decision has illuminated the identity that Canada is beginning to claim for itself. In the years ahead, as artificial intelligence reshapes the human experience in ways we are only just beginning to grasp, the nations that thrive will be those that understand a fundamental truth. Innovation and responsibility must grow together, or they will not grow at all. So, I leave you with this. Ask yourself what kind of future you want your country to inhabit. Do you want a future that is forever reliant on the stability and the whims of others, or do you want one that is built on institutions sturdy enough to govern the technologies that will define your civic life? That question will continue to matter long after today's headlines have faded into history. And if you found this exploration of the forces shaping our world useful, I invite you to stay engaged with me. Think deeply about the scaffolding of your democracy and your own place within it. Like the video, subscribe if you find real value in this kind of long-form reflection, and please share your thoughts so we can continue examining this complex world with clarity, with calm, and with curiosity together.